Ready? Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the fourth presentation. We've got Kim Pepper from Previous Next, our platinum sponsor, and he'll be talking about Capistrano. So, big applause, please, and we'll start off.
Thank you, thank you. Hi, welcome to my talk. I'm Kim Pepper, as I said. That's my contact details there. So today I'm going to talk about Capistrano, and before I start, I just thought I'd get a show of hands to see who in the audience is sort of developer. How many developers? Okay. Any systems administration people? A few? Cool, good mix. Anyone who's not either a developer or sysadmin, or is just, yeah, okay, good, welcome. Okay, so I guess another show of hands, I just want to understand how people are currently deploying their site. So who's using FTP to update their site? Yeah? Okay, who's sort of logging in via SSH and maybe updating via Git or doing something like that? Yeah, or SVN or whatever. How many people are using Aga? Yeah, okay. Anyone deploying with Drush? By R-syncing or doing, yeah, okay. Anyone using like Debian or RPM packages? Yep. And how many of you don't actually do deployment, someone else does it for you? No one? Oh, one? Yep, okay. Cool. Okay, so what are some of the issues that you might be facing with doing deployment in these ways? And the biggest ones for me, I think, are the fact that there's lots of manual processes involved. There's a number of steps that you may or may not need to do each time you do a deployment. So you may want to back up the database for a start in case you make some change that breaks the database scheme. You're going to have to update code because that's what you're doing the deployment for. If you've updated modules that need module updates, you'll have to run update DB. The update PHP script if you're doing it through the web interface. And you want to flush caches to make sure your changes are being shown. And because there's lots of manual steps, there's the potential there for human error. So you may have more than one person who's doing deployment. They may not know of a change that you've made. There's one of the steps could be missed. Someone might not have known that the caches need to be flushed. So, and there could be other steps that need to be done every time you do a deployment for your particular site. And if you're a small organization, typically you have developers who are also sysadmins or who kind of do everything. They may not be the world's best sysadmins, so they may have fairly loose restrictions on the server, so they may be allowed to log in, do whatever they want, change MySQL configuration or set permissions on directories so they're world writable, those kinds of things. And if you're a large organization, you may have a completely locked down server environment, so you're actually not allowed to log in and do anything at all. And hence the question about who actually doesn't deploy, because in some organizations you're not allowed to. You can tell the operations team that there's the latest version of the code's ready, and can you please deploy it for me? So obviously the problem with that is that there's not an instantaneous. You're not able to deploy when you may need to. There may be some hurdles that you have to jump through to do it. So you didn't know you had a problem, right? So I don't know if you've heard WebOps being mentioned around the place, but essentially it's the idea of trying to automate some of these processes. So it's an interaction between developers and systems operations people. And the intention there is to try to break down those barriers and give more power to the developers in order to be able to deploy their own stuff, but then have it locked down and have it in a state that the systems administrators are quite happy. So this can also, we're talking about developers and systems administrators, but the same applies. If you're performing both of those roles, then you need a tool that's going to give you that same benefit. So automatic, so all those manual processes you want to basically automate as much as you can, so there's no steps missed. Accessible, just meaning that people, whoever's in the team who needs to be able to do something can, and actionable. So you're not having to wait for someone else to do it. You can deploy and it happens instantly. Yep. Okay, so basically sysadmins, they don't want you touching their stuff necessarily, so it's good to try and keep those environments locked down. I don't know if you heard, anyone went to Miguel Jack's talk about AIGA briefly, but there's a lot of work that systems administrators put into keeping those environments locked down. So having conventions and consistency around, making sure security policies are met. There could be monitoring on things that you're not aware of. If you're logging in and moving files around, there could be things that are sitting there monitoring that or firing off alerts that make sure that everything's in the right place. Just keeping quality control. And most of the stuff on the server could be run by automated configuration management tools like Puppet or Chef. Is anyone using Puppet in their environments? Yeah? Okay, just a handful. Okay, so that's a tool essentially that lets you store all the configuration for a server in configuration files. So it basically keeps a copy of all the configuration that the server has, and you could basically bring up a new server with a vanilla install of Debian or whatever, run this script, and it will bring it up to the point in which it can start serving your site. So things like installing packages and configuration for those. So MySQL, for example, you could put all your MySQL configuration in there, and it just keeps it separate from the server, but you also get a clear record of what configuration that server has. So how can we work together? So the ideal goal is that developers are able to deploy rapidly. Sysadmins have tight control over those environments, and we can automate all those processes. So this is the kind of philosophical part of the talk, trying to give you a bit of the background picture about why we use Capistrano and what the intention of it is. Okay, so Capistrano is something that's going to fit all of these goals. So essentially, it's a developer tool. It's meant basically purely designed for deployment, and it integrates with your source control system. So if you're not using source control, you probably should be. So I don't have to go on about that. So a bit, first of all, about the structure, about what the differences are between, say, when you're just copying your files up to a server and how Capistrano deals with this. Essentially, each deployment lives in its own timestamp directory. So when you do a deployment, you get a folder that looks a little bit like this with a long timestamp on it. And the files that are common across all deployments are kept in a separate structure. And those are the ones that you typically don't live in version control. So things like your settings PHP or your uploaded files, those kinds of things, they're kept separate out of those releases directories. And essentially, all it does is put a symlink called current to the most recently deployed version of the site. So when you're setting up your Apache root path, then you just point it to current, and then every time you deploy it, that current symlink just points to the latest version of the site. Okay, so this is what it looks like on the server. So you can see if we're hosting our site on the server under this directory, this is a typical directory structure that you'll get. So current is just pointing to the symlink. You've got a releases folder, which has all the releases that you've got, and they will just be added to every time you do deployment. So you just keep getting new folders. And then you can see underneath shared, this is the stuff that doesn't change between releases. So cached copy is essentially a checkout of your Git repository. So when you do a deployment, it doesn't have to download the entire source again. It'll just take whatever changes you've made between releases. Files is just where all your typical Drupal files go. That just sits there, and your settings PHP. Okay, so inside your release, so inside your Drupal site, Drupal's expecting, certain directory structures to be there. So essentially what we do with Capistrano is that we create symlinks back to that shared directory. So site's default files, we just symlink that back to shared files. And same with settings PHP. So that might vary depending on how you do it. You can configure that however you like, but that's the standard sort of we use for most sites. So how does it work? So essentially it's just a library that lives on your development machine. So there's no software on the server. It doesn't do anything tricky. And it just exposes some settings that you can set that specify certain variables, I'll go into in a bit later, and then builds up these commands to run on the server. And it does that via SSH. So it'll SSH into the server and then just execute all these scripts for you. And I'll do a bit of a demo in a moment to show you that. And doing a deployment is essentially just typing in cap deploy at the command line, and that will do all the deployment for you. So to run all those steps. So everything else is automated. So deployment workflow. It's not that complicated, I promise. Okay, so this is a basic kind of diagram of how things work. You've got, first thing, you've got your local machine on the left, and then this is what's happening on the server on the right. So the first thing it does you'll be in your project directory, so it'll be the root of your Git repository. And it'll do a lookup of what version of Git, what the head of your Git repository is. It doesn't matter if it's a version, it'll do the same thing. It's not really dependent on a particular version control system. So once it's got that, it'll SSH into the server, typically using public key, so you don't have to type a password every time. And it will use that revision to check out into that shared cached copy folder the vision that you specified. You can also pass in a specific tag or something like that if you want to do it that way. We typically just use the head of the Git repository that we're at when we're doing deployment. It copies that site to a new timestamp folder, adds in all the symlinks, and then just updates the current symlink to point to that new version. Yeah. So it also exposes a whole lot of hooks. So that was the simple, basic Capistrano workflow. You can extend that. So there's these lifecycle events or tasks as they're called that happen when you do deployment. So you'll update the code, you'll create the symlinks and those kinds of things as I just mentioned. You're also able to add in your own behavior when each of those things is being fired to make sure that your own actions are being taken into account. So this is some of the examples of Capistrano commands. I'll go into a bit later. The main benefit, I think, is that you can instantaneously roll back to the previous release. So cap deploy rollback, all it does is just takes that current symlink and just points it to the one before. So you're instantly basically back to the version that you were before. The only caveat is that if you do run migrations on your database, it won't automatically restore from a backup of a database for you. You'll need to log in and do that manually anyway. That's probably a good idea not to, I don't know. I don't like the fact that if I do a rollback, it's automatically going to re-import the backup database. So just an extra step you'll need. But you can get a full list of Capistrano commands from the command line just by typing cap -t. Yeah?
Is it actually, Leon doesn't automatically.
You got to talk.
I got a question. I've forgotten my question in all the Does it doesn't automatically re-import the database, but during deployment, does it actually back up the database?
Yep.
Okay.
I'll take you through that in a moment. I'll do a live demo so you can see how it works. If we've got internet. Okay, so I'll just take you through, so that's about the structure and how you actually fire it off. So I'll just go through now a bit about what the configuration is, how you configure it to run. So it's written in Ruby. It's not made with Drupal, it's not a module, but it's originally from a Rails framework. So someone wrote it for deploying Rails apps. But although it's not specific, you can basically extend it to deploy any kind of application you like. Essentially, it's a domain-specific language for deployment. So it's easy to get Ruby installed on your machine. If you're using Mac OS, you've got it already. And it's a library that you install using Ruby Gems. So Ruby Gems is just the Ruby package manager. So and there's a simple command line to run install, which you can see here. So these are the gems that you'll need in order to run. I'll talk a little bit about what Capistrano Drupal is in a minute, but that's the command line to install Capistrano. It's pretty straightforward. So what does the Capistrano Drupal gem do for us? Okay, so the Capistrano Drupal gem is something I wrote to basically just add in all of the hooks that we needed in order to deploy a Drupal site. So by default, Capistrano doesn't know about Drupal, doesn't know about backing up the database, so it doesn't know about flushing caches. So the Capistrano Drupal gem does all this stuff for us. It's basically a library like Capistrano is itself, that just extends it and adds in a whole lot of extra tasks that you can use. And it also calls drush commands on the server. So I said before, it doesn't need any software on the server. It actually doesn't need drush, but it uses drush to perform most of these actions. So what are some of the tasks that it can run? So deploy setup. It will create the files directory in the right place, creates all the file structures, and will do things like set the group right permissions on the files directory, which is often a bit of a hassle when you're first setting up your Drupal site. And then these tasks are implementing some of these hooks that I mentioned before. So when we need to be able to create the files symlink back to the shared directory, or the settings PHP symlink back to that shared directory. So there's a task in there to do that for us. There's a backup DB task in there that will it just calls the backup migrate module to do a snapshot backup of your database, and the update DB one to actually run the migration. So these are all things that you can actually call independently. You don't actually have to. You can call them directly from Capistrano, but we'll use them to create like a recipe, if you like, for deployment, and just call these things in the right spot. So what is the Drupal deployment workflow? So basically, every time we do a deployment, whether we need to or not, we back up the database, we update the code from the Git repository, we create all the symlinks from files and settings, we run update DB, even if we don't have any updates, we just run it anyway. We flush the caches, and there's a bit of an added extra at the bottom. We just create a new Git tag with the timestamp and push that out so we know what version in Git is actually up on the server. Okay, so using it in your project. So what do you need to do to get it installed on your project? So on your local machine, we actually put Drupal under a subdirectory. We tend to just put Drupal and all the modules in Git, so we don't keep them separate and use drushmake or anything like that. We just found it easier for us, basically. And in order to use Capistrano, you need to have the bottom three files, or a config directory with a deploy.rb file in it, and a cap file. So the deploy.rb is where all your deployment settings go, the cap file is just there for Capistrano to know that, hey, you can run Capistrano on in this project, and it tells it about what libraries to load and all those kinds of things. But essentially, cap file, you just copy and paste from project to project. Where deploy.rb is where you have your site-specific settings. Okay, so this is an example of a deploy.rb file. So you don't need to have all of these settings. I'm just sort of trying to show you some just to illustrate the point. But you can see it's not a lot of code in order to set it up for each specific site. This is all that you need to basically start deploying sites using Capistrano. So the first one is basically we're just giving the project a name. So it's just used internally. We're telling it that we're using Git as source control. Give it the repository details. So that will be, obviously, it can be Git, it can be Subversion. It just needs those details in order to be able to check out the files. We can set a specific branch that we want to deploy from. So that means when it goes to check out, you can look at, a releases branch or a specific branch that whatever you like. You can specify a port, so it's using SSH. So if you're SSHing on a non-standard port, you can just set that here. And then it just tells it where do we want to put where's the project going to live on the server. So we're saying deploy to var ww, and we're just using this variable here that we set at the top. So it'll deploy to var ww example.com. But you can set that to whatever you like. And then set user and runner are really just used for the user is basically who we're going to log in. The user is who owns the files when we deploy, and the runner is who's running the application. So it could be the user that say Apache is running under, that kind of thing. And the last one is the role. So essentially here all it's doing is giving you the location of the server, so where to SSH into, where to deploy to. But there's also the significance of the role. So in Capistrano there's a notion that you may have different servers. You can have multiple servers all doing different things. So you could have a database server, an application server, maybe a reverse proxy server, and you can actually specify each task to target those different roles. So you may have 10 app servers, and you say, you could list them all here, and you could basically run a command, and only those things that need to happen on an app server will get run. So in this case, we've just got a simple example, but you can add other roles and add other servers and have multiple servers. Okay, so that's the basic setup. There's a few extras that I can show you that are generally useful. As I said before, server roles. So yeah, 2 dBs or 1 dB, you can basically specify those there. I don't tend to use them myself because only in Drupal, when you do an update DB, it always runs on the app server anyway, so it'll look up the database settings. But if you needed to do something specific on your database server, then you could write a task that would just target that specific thing. And by default, things like update code will only run on the app server anyway. So you can use a password if you like. So if you don't want to use SSH public keys, but that's it's less manual processes involved if you set up private public keys just to automatically SSH into the server. And also the other thing, you can set it up so it can use SSH key forwarding, which means that if you're logging into GitHub with the SSH key, you can use the same key that's on your local development machine to access GitHub, which means that you don't have to muck around with public keys for just specific for GitHub. So multi-stage deployment. So you can the basic example might be you've just got one environment. What happens when you've got like development, staging, and production environments, and you want to have different settings for each of those? So development you might have, a single box, but production you've got 3. You've got 2 application servers and a database server. You can actually set up, you can have it so that you can set up a separate configuration for each of those environments, and all it does is just takes the file name and says, okay, that's an environment under this directory structure. So you create a new deploy directory, create a .rb file, and then just put the specific differences in those files. And then to target those, you can specify the stage just before you actually run your deploy command. So by default, it'll just deploy, say, to dev every time you do cap deploy. But if you're ready to do a production deployment, then you type cap prod deploy or deploy to production. Okay, so how to add in custom commands. So essentially, it's all in Ruby. You can put this in your deploy.rb file. You don't have to create a library or do anything especially tricky. And this is the syntax of how to do something on the server. So in this example, I'm just trying to echo something on the server. So you can see here, first of all, I'm invoking the hook. So this is basically saying, when this event occurs, before this event occurs, call this function. And then we're defining it here. So we're just giving it a namespace, describing what it does. And this is where we're defining the task itself. And this run here basically just means run this on the server. So these are Capistrano functions that essentially would do all that for you. Okay. Is everyone still with me? Good. The other thing you can do is essentially filter things. So if you want to just target a specific role, so you might know that you've only got to do, for whatever reason, you want to do something just on one server or deploy just to one server, you can filter by host. So you can pass that in and Capistrano will only do it on that host. Or you can just target a specific role. So if you wanted to do a deployment, but you only want it to do the actions that will run on the database server, then you can pass in a filter and it'll do it that way. So yeah, another thing is gateways. So if you've got some environments, if you've got a fairly restricted lockdown production environment, you may actually need to log into another server and then do a deployment from there. So Capistrano supports that natively, so it's like tunneling. So essentially you just provide it with a gateway and it will do that for you. So you can just still cap deploy from your command line. It'll log into the first server and then SSH and run the SSH commands on the destination servers from that. So it's quite powerful. We're actually using this at the moment. And the other thing is if you use Git submodules, is anyone using Git submodules? Yep. So you can just give it a flag, and when it does the deployment and checks it out, it will update all the Git submodules as well. So it'll do all that for you. Okay, so live demo. Here we go. So this will be interesting.
You're very brave.
So I just wanted to show you, this is very command line stuff, right? So it's not like a GUI, it's not like Aga where you kind of drag and drop and you click. It's all command line, but it is very simple. So what I'll do is I'll just show you how to do a deployment, and I'll sort of explain what's going on, depending on the internet connection, how fast it will take. So this is just a demo site I've got set up. So you can see, first of all, it's outputting all the commands that are actually being run. So the first thing it's doing up here is just saying what revision am I going to use. Okay, so that's just doing that locally. Then it's basically building up a command to run on the server. I'm going to have to scroll back up. You can't see that. Okay. So you can see it's building up this massive long command to run on the server, and half of it is kind of, okay, if the Git repository doesn't exist on the server yet, then build it. And the other half is, if it does, then just do an update to this revision. So So it's just taken the SHA-1 of the Git commit that we got when we checked it locally, and then it's just saying, check it out at that revision. Okay, then it's telling us, okay, I'm going to run this on our dev server because we specified that in our configuration, and then it's executing these commands. Yeah. So the next thing it does is just copies that cache version to this releases folder. Like I said, under that releases folder, every time you do deployment, it creates a new timestamp directory, and it gets copied from the Git checkout that we just did. Okay, so this is what it's doing. This is the whole command. I'll just scroll down. Okay. Where are we? It's saying yes, it's all done. Okay, so the next thing is it's just should be deploying symlink. Okay, so now it's just making that, it's taking the old symlink that was pointing to the old revision and then creating a new one pointing to the new revision. Yeah. It's quite verbose, but it's telling you everything that it's doing basically. Okay, deploy symlink. Okay, so the next step is that it's basically taking the settings PHP and linking to that shared folder. So the files that Drupal expects in those places, like sites default files or sites default settings PHP, it's creating symlinks in that new release that we just deployed back to the shared directory, so that because they don't change between deployments. Yep. Okay, so the next thing it's doing now is say, okay, well, it's created that release. Now it's just going to run drush command. So it's running drush update DB. So that would just automatically run any module updates that are necessary. And the next thing you can see here is running another drush command. So it's running backup. Okay, so this is, sorry, I should explain this. Before it runs update DB, it runs backup. Not after. Okay, so you can see here it's just telling us that it backed up the database to using the backup migrate module. And then it's running update DB here, so to basically run any module updates. Okay. It's telling us no database updates are required. And then we're just running a drush cache clear to flush the caches. The last step is we're tagging our Git repository. So we just basically tag it with the timestamp. We use the environment that we're using. So if you're doing this in production, or it'll say what that is. So in Git, in the history, you've got a nice, clear kind of picture of when things were deployed and what branches they were on. And you've got a timestamp of the actual deployment as well. So it's very easy to say, when you deployed that last time, this thing broke. What was the last deployment that you did? And you can actually go through and see that quite easily. Okay, so that's the standard deploy. If I want to roll that back, just that. Okay, so I just roll back to the previous release. It's pretty quick. So that's the simple usage of Capistrano from the command line. There's other things you can do. There's a full list of commands you can output here. This is just showing you all the commands. You can see there's quite a few. A lot of them are standard, but there's some quite useful things that you can do in there. You could do things like tell Apache to restart every time you do a deployment, or something like that. Okay.
If you're getting Capistrano to do things like Apache restart, which require root, how do you do that in terms of access control?
Yeah, so that's a problem if you want it to restart. So a simple way is just to set up Apache to watch a file, and if you touch the file, it'll automatically restart. So That's one mechanism. You actually don't need to restart Apache for Drupal, so we don't actually do that. But you could do, if you need to do sudo things, there's also, it's usually best to actually enter, basically allow the user to be sudo, and then they'll have to enter a password. So an example of that is the deploy setup. So if you're setting up a new site structure, then you don't just want any user to be able to do that. So you can actually tell it, this is a sudo command, and it will actually prompt you for the password, and it will then create all the files and things like that.
Is that how you do the Apache setup, for example? First time site goes out? So the first time site goes out, if you want to set up all the Apache setup, is that done via Capistrano with you?
So we use a mix actually. So we use Puppet to provision servers, and we keep some Puppet configuration, some of that configuration in Puppet, and we tend to just use this for deployment. So I actually went down the path of like adding all these commands in there that would allow you to kind of do a one-stop setup using Capistrano, but I found that there's just too much like root user stuff that needed to be done, and it was actually just over the top.
Yeah, because you're probably only going to do it sort of at the beginning and
Yeah, that's right.
And then
Yeah. So yeah, we use Puppet for doing that.
Can I ask a really dumb question? Can you show us your cap deploy file for that example you just showed us?
Yep, I've got it here. Hey. Okay. So that's the project. So on the left, you can see I've got the application under the app folder. I don't know if that's too small. And then this is just the standard setup. So we're specifying the host, the Git repository, the port that we're SSHing. And this is a setting here, which I mentioned before, but if you're using multi-stage deployments, you can just set one to be default so that doesn't prompt you for one every time. Because if you don't do that, it won't let you deploy. It'll say you have to tell me what environment you're deploying to. So that just makes it easier if you're doing development deployments all the time. Yeah, so there's not a huge difference from the example that I showed you there.
How much more elaborate is the stuff you use internally? I've noticed you've got on GitHub Capistrano Drupal thing. Do you have much more internally, like for multi-server deployments and things? Or?
So the multi-server deployment's actually handled by it's outside the library that I wrote. It's actually in Capistrano Ext. It's like a separate library that's not part of the standard. And that adds the multi-stage deployment. But essentially all it does is just all of this stuff. There's a whole other talk I could talk about on Git workflow and using branches for deployment and those kinds of things. That we try to keep it pretty simple, just because we have a lot of people working on a lot of different projects, and it's easy to kind of get everyone on the same. So anyone can deploy in the organisation. So we don't just have like a gatekeeper there to deploy, and so we try to keep it simple. So I mean, as you can see, to set up a new project, essentially, it's just taking a file like this and just updating it with the path to the name of the site and the server that it's going to live on. It's not particularly complicated to just modify these settings. So, half of them don't get changed between projects anyway.
So with the shared directory that has the settings file and the files directory, where did you tell Capistrano how to symlink those into the?
So that's in the library that I wrote, because it's in the same place for us every time. If you're putting stuff in, so Capistrano doesn't deal with multi-site very well. So you could write an extension to support that, and you could override the locations. You can actually override all the tasks. So if you've got a specific project and you stick your settings file in a specific directory, it just means that you'll need to implement that code that does the update anyway. Why don't I show you the code for that just while we're here, just to show you what it does. Okay, so this is the source of that library. Essentially, all of this stuff's just cruft that you need to write a Ruby gem. The actual code's just here. So essentially, here is where I'm just doing what I could do in the example I gave you before. When you write your own task, you just do the same thing in here. So in this one, this is my Git command that I'm doing, and you just basically create a new tag, a new task, define it, and then you can just include that library, and all those commands are available to you. And I'll show you the, what was the one you wanted to see, the symlinks to the shed? Okay, so here, I'll just make that a bit bigger. Okay, so that's it. That's the code there that creates the symlinks to the files directories. So it's basically just saying, yeah, for each of those, just create that symlink in that directory, and that's it. So I mean, the source for this is on GitHub. The Ruby gem you can just download from rubygems.org, and yeah, feel free to submit patches or.
So this is a question probably more about workflow. Whilst I'd love to see us using Capistrano where I work, one of the things I've noticed is someone might be developing on the site, someone else might be doing some data entry, and you essentially can have several developers working at a time. Now, whilst we are keeping all of our code and version control, it's not so much of a local dev server situation necessarily. It just depends on what people are doing. And how would you see Capistrano being used in that kind of setup, or should we scrap that setup entirely? And if so, what kind of setup would you recommend?
So
workflow, I guess.
I'd probably just explain how we work, and so essentially everyone's just we don't have people making changes on the development server typically. So everything's done on your local machine. We use features, export that. So we're not deploying. We're not really overriding each other's stuff a lot, deploying to the development servers really at the point where you've resolved your issue and your QA, or you're providing it for QA. So I mean, there's probably a communication question in there, just about how you let other people know that you're doing a deployment. So that's not necessarily something that Capistrano is going to solve for you, but you could do things like add in messaging. So when you actually do a deployment, it sends an email that says, "I just deployed," or you could, post a tweet, or you could, you could send a chat room message or something like that, just so everyone's knowing, "Hey, you just deployed." Actually, I'm not using it now, but I used to have a tool that just watched Git repositories, and it would listen for whenever someone committed something to a shared repository, it would give you a little growl notification. Yep.
So I was just going to further to that. Is there any concept of logging or auditing of
Okay,
who's deployed what?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Is there any concept of logging or auditing of who's actually done deployments to production servers when?
Yeah, so in the Git tag, you can see that I've got down here. So when you do a tag, you can put a message against the tag, and I just grab the current user who's doing the deployment and just stick it in the tag message. So if you view the tag, it's like it was deployed by that user. So it's the GitHub username that tells you who did it.
I just wanted to briefly touch on what you were just saying in that previous point about watching the Git repo. If you are using Git as your as your version control system, you can actually use Git hooks. So you can say, when this repository has been updated, trigger these shell commands and do whatever it is, be it even it's some form of deployment or just a notification system.
Yeah. I think I can see the most use in something that tells you when you're doing a deployment. So it probably would make sense to tie something into Capistrano that when you do a deployment, it sends there's probably a library already out there that does it. Updates, posts a tweet or does something that people who are watching it would know, hey, the site I'm working on, just someone else deployed to it. Anyone else?
So just about the database backup. So one thing that we did was have like an A/B database. So, and you're just symlinking between different settings.php files, and then you can quickly revert a database.
Right.
So that was
Okay.
just one little handy hint.
Yeah. So you keep two databases, and then you just change your settings PHP to points. Okay. Yep.
I'd just like to compare that with AGA. My understanding of what you've got so far is it's pretty much an either choice. I can't see many ways in which this could be used in association with an AGA style setup.
No, they're two
You choose one or
completely
the other.
different ways of doing it. Yeah.
Thanks, that's a clarification I came
Yeah,
looking
yeah.
for, really.
There's many choices.
Anybody else? No more questions?
All right. Thank you.